All right, hello and welcome to part 8 of our little trip through Rousseau's Social Contract. This time we'll be covering the final two chapters of Book 2. Those are chapters 11 and 12, and they are titled The Various Systems of Legislation and The Division of the Laws, respectively. So, let's get started. Rousseau begins chapter 11 by stating that the, quote, end of every system of legislation, meaning its desired purpose, reduces to two things, quote, liberty and equality. This is, of course, using Rousseau's rather twisted definitions of liberty and equality, and this is where they come to the forefront. This is where they become a real problem. Rousseau notes that he has already defined civil liberty, which was done back in Book 1, Chapter 8. And what we see, if we go back there, is we observe that civil liberty is liberty that is limited by the general will. Now, the problem, of course, is that the general will's powers are, according to Rousseau, necessarily unlimited. Therefore, civil liberty is no real liberty at all. Or, it is whatever the state decides to leave to its cowed and dependent people. If those liberties happen to be good liberties, that's merely because you're in a lucky period. Because the incentive structure created by a system where some person has the ability to exercise unlimited power over other people, is necessarily going to draw people who have bad intentions into those positions, and you're going to end up with a bad state eventually. The fact that you don't have it now, it just means it's a matter of time. And of course, that's something that people are very often willing to kind of overlook, right? There's the old adage that, let me have peace in my time. Well, peace in my time, but at the expense of peace in my son's time or in my grandson's time? There's a pretty significant trade-off there, and it says a lot more about you that you're willing to trade peace in my time for oppression in your grandson's time than you might think. Quote, liberty, because all particular dependence means so much force taken from the body of the state, and equality, because liberty cannot exist without it, end quote. Liberty, in fact, cannot exist with most meaningful definitions of equality. The only possible holdout would be something like equality under the law, which would require all laws to apply to all citizens equally, e.g. no individual or group identifiers in the law. But Rousseau has already said in Book 2, Chapter 6, that the law absolutely can be used to nudge various groups in various directions. Rousseau goes on, quote, by equality, we should understand not that the degrees of power and riches are to be absolutely identical for everybody, but that power shall never be great enough for violence and shall always be exercised by virtue or of rank and law, and that in respect of riches, no citizen shall ever be wealthy enough to buy another, and none poor enough to be forced to sell himself, which implies on the part of the great moderation in goods and position, and on the side of the common sort, moderation in avarice and covetousness. End quote. This is, again, kind of Rousseau's subsistence farming thought. What it effectively does is it creates a permanent underclass of welfare recipients, since poor is always a relative statement that can be used to justify more expropriation, right? You can always say, well, this guy has more than me, so I want more, I want more, I want more, until everyone is equal. And we know that, doing that inevitably results in the people who are actually producing things giving up, because they're not, perfect angels willing to sweat and toil for nothing in return. I'll link to a Ryan McMakin article that I think is kind of relevant to this point, worth reading. I'll put that in the description, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. Then, what also happens is that we cut the heads off of any potential great servants of customers. And, from the Misesian perspective, this is really what we want. We want people who are willing and able to find a way to serve and improve the lives of as many people as possible by way of voluntary transactions. And what we're doing by preventing people from getting above some particular value of wealth is we're preventing ourselves from reaping the benefits of their good choices, while also creating. And it's important to note that this isn't just rich and poor, right? The thing that you also have to worry about here is that there's going to be this vast and ever-growing parasitic bureaucrat class that is going to get its cushy pay from overseeing the movement of wealth from the rich to the poor. And, of course, because they have this particular job, they're going to end up moving in the direction of a particular mindset that is more and more hostile to productivity and more soft on laziness. Rousseau goes on, quote, "Such equality, we are told, is an unpractical ideal that cannot possibly or cannot actually exist. But if its abuse is inevitable, does it follow that we should not at least make regulations concerning it?" A little bit of a ellipsis here. But continuing the quote, "Because the force of circumstances tends continually to destroy equality, the force of legislation should always tend to its maintenance." End quote. Now, if the force of legislation should always tend toward the maintenance of unpractical equality, what it means is that the state will effectively be welfare statist or socialist. This is simply the unproductive and parasitic classes claiming power over the productive, and there's no reason why the productive would maintain a position in such a dangerous and destructive social contract. No productive person would consent to being subjugated in this way, which goes well along with Rousseau's kind of subsistence farming perspective. He goes on, "These goals must be modified to account for the conditions and temperament of the people," he says in so many words. This is effectively meaningless. It allows legislators vast leeway in deciding what the law should be, and of course they will do so to their own benefit, at least if not now, then eventually. He continues. He gives this extended paragraph basically outlining how people should do what's most profitable under the circumstances and conditions they're in. This, of course, is something that no law is needed to actually do. This is just Ricardo's law. I'll put a link in the description, and I'll put a link in the show notes to an article about that kind of touches on that by Lou Rockwell, I think. What he's basically talking about is people choosing their relatively most productive types of labors. This is something that is very strange because this has been written well after The Wealth of Nations, and so the effect of a free market allowing people to choose the most productive thing and thus, gain as much wealth as they desire before moving on to lesser things is well known at this point, but Rousseau completely ignores it. The state is not necessary to enforce people doing the thing for themselves and that is most profitable for them. It's only, if it's necessary to prevent them from doing certain things that are involuntary transactions between them and others. What'll end up happening is that you'll have this massive unproductive underclass, and what's going to happen is that probably the welfare state is either going to grow to a point where it totally oversizes the productivity of the nation and collapses, or what they're going to have to do is basically come up with whips in order to keep people from becoming layabouts. There's a footnote here on page 46 in my copy. It's basically a defense of autarky and protectionism. It's from, Rousseau mentions a guy named Monsieur d'Argenson and says, quote, who says, quote, "Any branch of foreign commerce creates on the whole only apparent advantage for the kingdom in general. It may enrich some individuals or even some towns, but the nation as a whole gains nothing by it, and the people are no better off," end quote. This is, of course, autarkic nonsense, mercantilist nonsense. It's a false distinction between individuals and the people, and the argument basically leads to complete trade isolationism and usually poverty. Rousseau goes on, quote, "What makes the constitution of a state really solid and lasting is the due observance of what is proper, so that the natural relations are always in agreement with the laws on every point, and law only serves, so to speak, to assure, accompany, and rectify them," end quote. Laws should be good and do good things. This is an idiotic bit of utopianism that cannot be relied on in any actual realistic system. There's no sense of incentives. There's no sense of the problems that what we now call public choice theory raises. And there's no sense of any sort of calculation problem. Now, we can't necessarily blame Rousseau for not understanding public choice theory and Mises' calculation problem, but it's pretty clear that this system is running up against the same problems that any socialist system would. It's going to end up trying to control everything. It's going to tell people this is the profitable thing when that information is out of date. It's going to stifle innovation. It's going to create a massive underclass, as well as a massive upper class of bureaucrats that enforce all these crazy rules, and you're going to end up with hell on earth. Rousseau continues. He concludes this chapter with a point along these lines. "If legislators make the wrong choices, then, quote, laws will insensibly lose their influence, the Constitution will alter, and the state will have no rest from trouble till it is either destroyed or changed," end quote. However, as Rousseau said in Book 2, Chapter 2, the state is permanent and indivisible. It can't be broken apart this way. In Rousseau's framework, the only way to exit the body politic is by committing a crime that's so bad that they think you're not rehabilitatable. You can't be rehabilitated from it. As long as the state thinks it might rehabilitate you, it can pull you in and do whatever it wants to you, because that's the general will. You can see the problems with this. Rousseau says this thing is a contract, and it's based on like it must be this because otherwise it wouldn't have enough force. It gives infinite power to the state, and then he's like, well, but if things go bad, then things go bad, and whoopsie daisy, the state will collapse. And it's like, well, you probably should have handled this earlier, because based on the poor logic of your framework, it's going to happen a lot. It's just really, really bad. So, that is chapter 11. And remember, the name of that chapter is The Various Systems of Legislation, which it didn't really cover any systems of legislation, but there it is. All right, let's move on to chapter 12, which is a short one. Rousseau, again, this one's called The Division of the Laws, and Rousseau says that there are 4 classes of laws in his framework. And the question that, of course, any reasonable person is going to be asking is the question that's raised by looking at Book 2, Chapter 6. Does this violate Rousseau's earlier dictum that the law is perfectly general, but anything specific is a decree? And we're going to see that he tries, and we're going to see how it goes. Number 1, Rousseau talks about political laws or fundamental laws, which are, quote, action of the complete body upon itself, the relation of the whole to the whole, of the sovereign to the state. Now, this part seems to be kind of vaguely consistent with his earlier concept of law, for better or worse, and here's why I say that. Action of the complete body upon itself. This is like the rules of the system that is designed to operate under, right? Like, the sovereign shall maintain a legislature of yada 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 and an executive of yada yada yada. The relation of the whole to the whole. I mean, all of these things are kind of vague and nebulous collectives that don't really exist in any meaningful way. And because of this, what they can be made to mean is also vague and also very dangerous. A person can say that, this is the whole, and therefore, this law is a relation of the whole to the whole kind of thing. And, it could be something that, could be very easily argued to not be the case. And then of the sovereign to the state, well, the sovereign doesn't really exist, and the state is just the sovereign when it's exercising power, so I don't know where he's going with that. But, it's at least consistent with his dictum that laws must be general, at least. He continues, quote, a people is always in a position to change its laws, however good, for if it chooses to do itself harm, who can have a right to stop it, end quote. Well, this is kind of the problem that people like Locke are trying to find a workaround for. A state with strictly limited powers, if such a thing could be made to exist, would be an example of such an attempt. This would be true given Rousseau's framework and its totalitarian state, however, that the people can choose to do itself harm. But what we're really worried about oftentimes is more one small group of people taking over the name of the people. And then harming everybody else for their own benefit, right? Even if the people group might be 51%. Rousseau's framework has no defense against this kind of nonsense. That the whole purpose of all of this philosophy that was going on in the late 17th and 18th centuries was trying to say, hey, we need something better and something more principled than just a king who can do whatever he wants. Well, Rousseau, Locke made a lot of mistakes, right? He was like, well, we have prerogative, we have dominion, we have taxation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have a lot of problems, but he at least was trying to move in a direction of a state as a servant to the people, as opposed to a servant to itself and its own whims. Something limited, because Locke was very clear that there should be some significant limits on the power of the state. Something related to, the conception of natural law by that particular group of people, right? And there's just none of that here in Rousseau. It's just completely, the state can do whatever it wants and good luck, good freaking luck, basically. It's not it's not helpful. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't get us anywhere other than some guy saying, I am your general will instead of I am your king. But let's keep moving. Number 2. Rousseau talks about civil laws. Quote, members one to another or to the body as a whole. End quote. Basically, make each individual independent of others but dependent on the city, quote, as the strength of the state can alone secure the liberty of its members, end quote. Well, these could be general, but are very likely to be filled with nudges and caste systems, whether soft or hard. The dependency of the individual on the state is also disconcerting, and it leads to very dangerous incentives, right? It leads to a system where everybody is dependent on the state, and therefore the state has way too much leeway in deciding what the economy does, for instance. Then you have the central planning problem, which both Mises and Hayek have talked about. I've linked to those, to a couple of articles on those things in previous episodes. I don't need to do that again here, I hope. He moves on. Number 3, criminal laws. Quote, relation between the individual and the law, a relation of disobedience to its penalty, end quote. These are even closer to being meaningless as anything other than decrees, since they can only take the forms of punishments or expulsions. A criminal law says, thou shalt not murder. But you also need a system of, what would you call it? I guess political laws that say this is how you determine whether or not someone has murdered. And it gets more complicated in that the further you go from simple, I have observed aggression, now we punish aggression kind of thing. And then you have to think about like the different levels of punishment. There's a lot of leeway here where you could have criminal laws that do horrible things like, in a valid Rousseauian system, you could have criminal laws that make certain crimes possible and, laudable by certain elements of the people and, deny them to others. Taxation, for instance, would be a good example of something nudging up against that line. It's legal for a tax collector to take your money, but it's not legal for your neighbor to take your money unless he's a tax collector. And the 4th category of law is the real scary part here in this chapter. And it comes at the end because Rousseau is putting the more reasonable things at the beginning and the more awful things at the end, as we've been seeing in the last couple of parts. So I'm just going to read some quotes here. Quote, most important of all, ellipsis, forms the real constitution of the state, takes on every day new powers when other laws decay or die out, restores them or takes their place, keeps a people in the ways in which it was meant to go, and insensibly replaces authority by the force of habit, end quote. These he calls morality and custom, and he says that the great legislator concerns himself in secret with these. And yet earlier the existence of customs and traditions was an obstacle to the legislator. This is, of course, the real chunk, and Rousseau's characterization of it is very worrisome, because he's suggesting that the clever legislator may fiddle with customs and morality in secret using subterfuge or propaganda. This is, of course, the opposite of what we want our government to do, generally speaking. The other thing about it that's kind of worrisome is the fact that it's a completely unwritten constitution, right? This was part of the problem that the American founders had with the British Constitution. They thought they had all these rights, and then the British came back with the Intolerable Acts and said, you shall bow to us in, what was the exact phrasing? In all cases whatsoever, right? And the Americans said, well, no, there's a constitution. It may not be written, but we have rights. And there are certain things that you can't tell us to do or order, that you can't tell us to do or order us to do or whatever. And, the British Empire was basically saying, no, that you have no rights. And that was a big part of the reason why they were like, well, then screw you, down with kings. To a certain degree, right? Of course, we know that the revolutionary effort was kind of thwarted by the Constitution itself, but the Constitution at least is a written document, and so you can at least make kind of a look at it and say, well, it doesn't say this, right? There are multiple different ways that you can interpret a Constitution, and the best one, of course, is to look at what people at the time said it meant, right? If we're going to believe in this kind of social contract document, which I'm not recommending we do, right? But if we're going to do it anyway, or if we're going to do it just to kind of look at things from the perspective of modern democratic states, then what you have is a document where people argued about what was going to be in it, what the things that were in it meant, and what should go into it and what should not go into it. You can use all this information that you have to make a pretty good interpretation or understanding of what the document meant when it was ratified. And of course, if you just look at the words that are in the document, a clever legislator, in the Rousseauian sense, can use subterfuge and propaganda to gradually change the names or the meanings of words until the Constitution means something different. You don't want that either, because now you have a fluid document that doesn't mean anything but what the lawmaker says it does. Ideally, you look at what it meant when it was created. As a second best, you look at what it actually says. Ideally, you do that while looking at what the meanings of words were when it was ratified. If you can't do that for whatever reason, then you at least look at it with the meanings that words have now, because the meanings of words are a little bit more stable, at least, than the whims of legislators. And in the worst case, in the absolute worst case, the Constitution means whatever the lawmaker says, and then you just have might makes right again, because the legislator is the guy who can tell the army to shoot you if you don't agree with him. So what we're seeing here is very unfortunate. First off, Rousseau is putting a lot of weight on some form of equality, that he is saying, well, if equality is hard to reach, then all the laws should be on reaching toward it. And it's like, well, that doesn't follow. That doesn't make any sense. Equality might not be something that we want to reach at all. At least certain forms of equality. And the fact that the word equality can mean something that is at least hypothetically reasonable, like equality under the law versus equality of outcome, the fact that you can use the same word for both of these things means that they're inevitably going to be kind of like a foggy line between them, and people are going to switch it up. They're going to Mott and Bailey it. They're going to say, well, this is equality, and then when you say, well, no, I mean equality under the law, but no, I mean, they're going to use it in vague ways. We have Rousseau aiming for a constant, permanent underclass that is forced to labor because the bureaucrats require these massive wealth transfers. You, of course, have the bureaucrats themselves skimming off of the wealth transfer and getting fat off of that. Then we have the divisions of laws, where, only one of these divisions of laws is strictly general, as Rousseau already said that laws must be. And then the other ones are worse, because the quote unquote civil laws are very likely to be filled with nudges and soft caste systems. The criminal laws can only really serve as decrees when also combined with one of his fundamental laws. And the idea that morality and custom are also a form of the law is kind of a positivist position, where there's nothing to point back at and say, well, this is the standard, it should aim toward this. Legislators can just do whatever they want with that, and Rousseau even notes that they should, or that if they're good, they'll do that, which of course is the kind of chilling totalitarian nonsense that we all want to avoid. So this concludes part 8 of my look at Rousseau's social contract. We have finished book 2. I believe there's a book 3 and a book 4. That's probably as far as we're going to go. As we've seen, this does not bode well for anything. It's a really, really bad system with a lot of weird loopholes and a lot of strange, vague language, and a lot of totalitarian power given to the state when it doesn't really need it. Rousseau claims that he does, but he does so without making a very solid argument. So anyway, we'll be back next week with part 9, cover a couple chapters in book 3, and have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time.